The blaring sound of the alarm jolted him awake. Tyler reached out groggily to silence it, but his arm felt lighter, smoother. He blinked and rubbed his eyes, but the sight before him remained the same. Long, chestnut-colored hair spilled over his pillow and shoulders, framing a face that wasn't his own. Panic set in as he sat up. The blanket slid away, revealing a slender, unfamiliar body draped in a light, lavender nightgown. His hands flew to his chest, where he felt the soft, unmistakable curve of a woman's body. Heart racing, he stumbled out of bed and caught sight of the full-length mirror in the corner of his room. The reflection staring back at him wasn't his. The girl in the mirror had delicate features, wide, expressive eyes, and a lithe figure. She was beautiful in a way Tyler had never considered about himself, or anyone. What happened to me?" he whispered, his voice high and melodic, foreign even to his own ears. He turned to his room, desperate for answers, but it wasn't the room he remembered falling asleep in. His posters were gone, replaced by pastel artwork and floral decorations. His desk was covered with makeup and beauty products, and his closet, he hesitated before opening it. Inside hung a collection of dresses, skirts, and feminine tops. There were no t-shirts, no jeans, nothing familiar. Tyler's breath quickened. It wasn't just his body that had changed. His entire life seemed to have been rewritten. "Tyra. Breakfast is ready," a voice called from downstairs. His stomach sank. Tyra? Was that his name now? Mechanically, he pulled on a pair of shorts and a fitted t-shirt from the closet. They clung awkwardly to his new figure, making him feel even more out of place. He didn't know what else to do, so he went downstairs. His mother was in the kitchen, cheerfully humming as she placed a plate of pancakes on the table. "Good morning, sweetie. You've got a busy day ahead, don't forget your choir practice after school." Choir practice? Tyler didn't even sing. He stared at his mother, who showed no sign of noticing anything strange. Yeah. Sure, Mom," he muttered, sitting down at the table. His father entered the kitchen, ruffling Tyler's hair as he passed. "Morning, champ. Or should I say, princess," he teased, laughing. It wasn't mean-spirited, but it sent a chill through Tyler. School was a blur of unfamiliar faces treating him like they'd known him forever. Teachers called him Tyra, classmates waved and smiled, and even the lockers looked different. His best friend Mark sat next to him in biology, acting strangely shy and hesitant. "Are you okay?" Mark asked during a lull in the lecture. Tyler nodded stiffly. "Yeah, just a weird morning." Mark smiled nervously. "Well, if you need anything, I'm here." The day dragged on, each moment more surreal than the last. Every interaction drove home the fact that Tyler's old life was gone. At lunch, a group of girls invited him to sit with them, giggling and chatting as though he'd always been part of their circle. By the time school ended, Tyler was exhausted from pretending to belong. Back at home, he locked himself in his room and sat on the bed, trying to make sense of everything. That's when he noticed something glinting under the bed, a small, silver pendant. He reached for it, and the moment his fingers touched it, a memory surfaced. The previous night, frustrated after another argument with his parents about his future, he'd held the pendant and made a wish. "I just wish I could understand what it's like to be someone else," he had muttered. He hadn't expected anything to happen. But now, it seemed the pendant had granted his wish in the most literal way. As he held the pendant, Tyler's panic began to subside. He thought about the day he'd just lived, the way people treated him, the warmth of the girls who had welcomed him, even Mark's quiet kindness. It was a perspective he'd never experienced before, one that opened his eyes to things he'd taken for granted. Tyler looked at the mirror again, this time with a calmer gaze. The girl staring back wasn't just a stranger. She was him, part of him, at least. The longer he looked, the more he realized she didn't seem so foreign anymore. "I wished for this," he whispered. "And maybe I needed it." That night, Tyler placed the pendant in a drawer and closed it. He didn't know how long this change would last, but he wasn't going to spend the time wishing it away. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was truly seeing the world, and himself, for what they were. And as he drifted off to sleep, he smiled, feeling at peace for the first time in a long time. The next morning, he woke up feeling surprisingly calm. The initial shock of seeing himself in the mirror had worn off. He stretched his arms, now accustomed to their delicate proportions, and let out a soft yawn. The girl in the mirror stared back with a quiet confidence he didn't recognize the day before. Descending the stairs, he found his mom humming in the kitchen again. "Tyra, can you run an errand for me later? We're out of milk and eggs," she said without looking up from the pan. "Sure, Mom," he replied instinctively, surprised by how natural his voice sounded. As he sat at the breakfast table, he noticed how easily he'd started to move in this new body. The awkwardness of the previous day was gone, replaced by an unfamiliar ease. He wasn't sure if it was muscle memory or something else, but he wasn't about to question it. The walk to the store was uneventful, though Tyler, or Tyra, as he was starting to think of himself, couldn't ignore the occasional glances he received. It wasn't leering or uncomfortable, just different. People smiled, nodded, or held doors open in a way that felt oddly nice. Returning home, he found the pendant still in the drawer where he'd left it. Picking it up, he turned it over in his hands. He didn't feel fear or regret, just curiosity. What had it really done? Had it altered reality entirely, or just his perspective? That evening, he sat on his bed with the pendant, lost in thought. His parents' voices drifted up from the living room, warm and light-hearted, a stark contrast to the tense arguments they used to have. They treated him differently now, not with the pressure they used to exert on Tyler, but with a quiet, nurturing respect they seemed to reserve for Tyra. Mark texted him, asking if he wanted to hang out over the weekend. Tyra smiled at the message, but for the first time, she hesitated. Mark had been a great friend, but something in his demeanor had changed. She wasn't sure if she wanted to confront it or let it play out naturally. School became easier over the next few weeks. The girls he sat with at lunch were quick to accept him fully into their group, and their kindness softened the edges of his uncertainty. Tyra learned things she'd never cared to notice before, how friendships among girls were built on an unspoken network of support and understanding, and how emotions were shared openly rather than bottled up. One day, as she was cleaning her room, she came across an old photo of herself, Tyler, grinning awkwardly at the camera. She stared at it for a long time, feeling a strange mixture of nostalgia and detachment. Tyler wasn't gone, she realized. He was still there, but he'd grown into something new. Someone new. Her mom knocked on the door and stepped in, holding a small box. "I found this in the attic," she said, handing it over. "Thought you might like it." Inside were childhood keepsakes, notes, drawings, and a bracelet Tyler had made years ago. Tyra ran her fingers over the worn string and colorful beads, feeling a surge of emotion. That night, she held the pendant one last time. "Thank you," she whispered, placing it back in the drawer. She no longer needed it to remind her of who she was. Years later, Tyra stood in the same room, now filled with memories of her life. The mirror reflected a confident young woman, someone who had grown to embrace the world as it was, and herself as she had become. The pendant remained in the drawer, untouched but cherished, a quiet reminder of a journey that had changed everything. And as she looked out the window, she smiled, knowing her story was complete. Life settled into a rhythm, one that Tyra had grown to embrace wholeheartedly. The once overwhelming shock of her transformation had faded into something much simpler, acceptance. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. The girl who had once stood in front of the mirror in disbelief now saw herself as someone whole, someone who belonged. One Saturday morning, Tyra woke to the sound of her phone buzzing incessantly. It was a message from Mark, urging her to meet him at their favorite coffee shop. "It's important," the text read. She hesitated for a moment, sensing something in his tone that made her nervous, but she quickly brushed it aside and got ready. The cafe was bustling when she arrived. Mark sat in their usual corner, fidgeting with his coffee cup. When he saw her, his face lit up with a smile that was both familiar and different, a mix of relief and something deeper. "Hey," he said as she sat down. "Hey," she replied, taking a sip of her iced latte. What's up? Mark hesitated, then looked her straight in the eye. I need to tell you something, and I don't want it to change anything between us. Tyra's heart skipped a beat, but she nodded for him to continue. I like you, Tyra. I've liked you for a while now. His voice was steady, but his hands betrayed his nerves as they gripped the edge of the table. For a moment, the world seemed to pause. Tyra felt a rush of emotions, surprise, flattery, and something else she couldn't quite name. She'd noticed Mark's subtle shifts in behavior, the way he looked at her, but she chalked it up to their close friendship. Mark, she began, but he interrupted. I'm not asking for an answer right now. I just needed you to know. You've always been important to me, even before everything. He gestured vaguely, referring to her transformation without saying it outright. Tyra smiled softly. Thank you for telling me. And for being here, through all of this. I don't know what I'd do without you. They spent the rest of the afternoon talking, the weight of his confession melting away into their usual banter. Tyra didn't give him an answer that day, but something in her heart felt lighter, more open. As the months passed, Tyra continued to grow into herself. She joined the school's choir, surprising even herself with her love for singing. She found joy in the simple things, walking home from school, laughing with friends, and even experimenting with fashion and makeup. The world, once intimidating and unfamiliar, now felt full of possibilities. One evening, as she was sorting through her drawer, she came across the pendant again. It gleamed softly in the fading sunlight, a relic of the wish that had changed her life. Holding it in her hand, she felt no need for answers or reversals. Instead, she walked to the edge of the woods behind her house, where the air was quiet and still. She dug a small hole beneath an old oak tree and placed the pendant inside, covering it with earth. Thank you, she whispered, her voice steady. But I don't need you anymore. Years later, Tyra stood on a stage, her voice soaring through a packed auditorium. She had found her place, her passion, and her purpose. In the crowd, her parents beamed with pride, and Mark sat front and center, cheering louder than anyone. As the applause filled the room, Tyra took a deep breath, her heart full of gratitude. Her story was complete, not because of how it began, but because of how she chose to live it. And she never looked back.